Hello and welcome back to the channel today. In today's video I thought I would discuss one of the techniques that you use in photograph, a thing called foreground interest, what it's for, how you use it and how it can help your photography. Okay, so what is foreground interest? So basically, foreground interest is a use of, in photography, is a use of anything that generally is in the first third of an image. So, for example, which you could put a rock in in front of a photograph, and it would provide prominence as a focal subject into that image, which could be used as a way of drawing in, yourself to a main focus point, or other techniques could be used. So foreground interest could be really, really good to make an interesting image. It can take basically a very plain image and make it very, very, very interesting. So foreground interest is a very good thing to learn in your photography. For these first two images here, I'm going to show you an image of the lighthouse at Perch Rock over on the Wirral, which is not far from where I am here, and it's a very prominent and very well photographed lighthouse. And one of the great things about this lighthouse is that it has a lot of rock formations around the lighthouse that appear and disappear depending on the tide. So as the tide goes out, you get more and more of these rocks exposed, and as the tide comes back in, these rocks disappear under that tide depending on how high it is. And one of the great things about these rocks is that they create a great amount of foreground interest. So, for example, this image on the right here is the lighthouse, and it's just a simple lighthouse image on its own. Why it's a good image, but it's a little bit boring for my liking, so it doesn't provide much interest. Whereas this second image on the left here, which is the lighthouse, around about the same time, focused out. Obviously I've zoomed out quite a fair bit, and it's exposing some of the rocks, and these rocks provide a little bit of foreground interest and actually draw your eye into the lighthouse. So it's a good example of using foreground interest to add depth into your image. It can create a sense of scale and a sense of depth in the image to make something look more prominent and more interesting. So, for example, in this one here, this image, it does provide a little bit more of a leading line into the image and shows you a little bit more depth. So it's always good to find a little bit of prominence in front of you to show prominence of something further in the background. And I think this is quite a good example of a foreground interest. Obviously the composition's a little bit messy, and it's a composition that I'm not particularly extremely happy with, but it sort of proves and it shows it shows how you can use a little bit of foreground interest to provide prominence to to an image, to a focus point that's in the distance, and I think it adds a little bit more interest into what would be a very boring, a very dull subject if not done right. So on this image here, I'm using foreground interest to tell a story. I think one of the things that we forget as photographers is to actually tell a story with our images. You can literally go and photograph a lighthouse like this, and there'll be 1,000,001 shots that'll probably look exactly the same because they're just trying to focus on the lighthouse. Whereas this image here tells the story of the lighthouse, but also it tells you where you are. So, for example, you're on a beach. You can see the docks and things in the background, so it tells you that you're near the sea. It shows you more about what's around the lighthouse and the imagery, but also the bunch of flowers in the foreground is also telling you a story that it may be. It may be a tribute to somebody who's been lost at sea previously, or it could be somebody. It could be a tribute to somebody who was a sailor or a person who liked to be at sea. So it tells an interesting story and adds a little bit of interest and mystery to an image. So foreground interest can actually tell you, it can provide interest to your image, but also it can provide a little bit of a story and a little bit of, background to what the image is and where it is and, where the photograph. So if you want to use foreground interest, always use it to tell a story as well. It's always a good thing to do, and it makes your photographs more interesting. On this image here, it's a photograph taken on one of the back streets in Liverpool, and it's I'm always asked about finding foreground interest in the urban environment and how difficult it is. I know a lot of people struggle with urban photography, because it can be quite chaotic and it can be quite overwhelming. There's subjects everywhere, and it's very difficult to find a prominent subject. Whereas things like this is that if you use markings in the road, or if you use prominent features of the pavements and the buildings around you, you can always find a little bit more foreground interest in your imagery. So, for example, this is using the double yellow lines and the grid in front of me. The grid's a little bit messy. I would have been happier if it would have been a bit cleaner, but that's just, I think it tells part of the story that you're in the urban environment, and sometimes some urban environments are not as clean as we would like them. But one thing I like about this image is that it actually uses the foreground interest and the double yellow lines to actually lead you to the subject, which in this case, I think that subject would be lost but for those lines taking you to show you that person. I think, particularly in this image, I think it might have been better had I have waited, maybe 4 or 5 seconds and wait for the person to come to me close. But it was a difficult situation to take a photograph. I was crouching down. I was sort of crouching over the edge of the pavement, and I think there was possibly cars coming past me nearby. So it's a case of timing the image right, and I think that I quite like this image because it uses the leading lines to draw you into a subject. So a good use of foreground interest is to draw you into a subject. For this final image, I just wanted to illustrate the point of using foreground interest wisely. I think sometimes we tend to look for foreground interest in everything we do. Especially beginner photographers, when they're starting out, they tend to look for foreground interest all the time, or leading lines, or they tend to look for one thing all the time, and sometimes that foreground interest can be it can be not needed. So, for example, on this image, I think the foreground rock does provide a nice bit of foreground interest, but I do think it's quite messy and it's quite distracting, and it can be a little bit overwhelming for the subject, which is obviously the bench in the background. And also we've got a lot of rocks over in the midground, which I think does make it look cluttered and it looks messy, and I think it distracts you away from the actual subject. So foreground interest, while it's a good thing to use, it can be a little bit distracting and it can be overused if you don't use it correctly. So these subjects and these types of composition rules are there to be broken and they're there to be used, but they can be overused and over exaggerated, so it's careful to use those those rules and set composition rules very wisely, or else you could end up with a very distracting foreground interest which can actually lead you away from the subject. So use it sparingly, learn to use it correctly, and I think it's a great tool for creating some fantastic images. Okay, so I hope you found that little discussion about foreground interest and the use of foreground interest images in images useful. As I said in my earlier point, if used properly and used in the right way, it can create a great interest in your image. It can make a quite dull image to be very, very interesting. But also it can be overused, and sometimes we can go a little bit too far with foreground interest. So it's I think it's a case of practicing, use it sparingly, try it. Okay, so I hope you find that useful. If you like what you see, please leave a comment below and tell me how you use foreground interest to create fantastic images. I'd love it if you could give me a like or a thumbs up down below. Share it. I'd love you to share this video across your social medias, and hopefully I will see you again next time.